You're listening to How to Stan, the podcast all about both specific fandoms and fandom culture as a whole. For more information about the show and the other show that I do, 17 Karat K-Pop, visit 17karatkpop.weebly.com. You can also go to 17karatkpop.weebly.com/howtostan for more specific information about this podcast. Enjoy the show. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to How to Stan. Part 1 of today's episode is just a few minutes of summarizing to refresh your memory or to introduce you to all of the key characters in SpongeBob and the main sources of the plot. Once you've got the gist of it, then I will dive into my countdown of the top 10 best SpongeBob episodes. And then to tie everything together, at the end, I'll read parts of an essay I wrote. Yes, I actually wrote an essay in school about SpongeBob that I think really summarizes why this show actually has way more social commentary in it and really interesting jokes you don't fully get until you're older that explain why this show is so extremely popular and stands the test of time because there's something in it for everyone. You can grow up with it, not be tired of it. It's very well done and has a lot more layers to it than it looks like on the surface. Part of the joy of SpongeBob is the fact that it is 3 stories in one. You have your classic superhero tale that kids love with the sea creatures, Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy, and they have this team of supervillains they are always going up against, but they're really goofy superheroes. They're kind of semi-retired, they live in an old folks' home, and it's just, the comedy writes itself with that premise. They're past their prime, but SpongeBob is a super fan anyway. So you have that plot. Then you have SpongeBob, just his cute, wholesome adventures with his best friend Patrick, the starfish who is one of his neighbors. They're always annoying their other neighbor Squidward and just having a lot of sweet, innocent fun together. Sometimes they hang out with Sandy Cheeks, the squirrel who lives underwater with the help of an air helmet. SpongeBob's basic trait is his boundless optimism, or as he put it, secretly, I'm a little bit naive. He truly does drive everyone crazy and isn't even trying. He's like too pure for this world. And so in a world full of jaded people who question everyone's motives, his pureness and goodness and honest desire to just help people catches everyone off guard and annoys some of them. He kind of defies social norms in that way. So he just has this boundless energy despite the fact he still does not have his boating license. He continues to try to get it week after week and runs his boating instructor, Mrs. Puff, mad over it. Yes, they drive boats instead of cars here. He's boundlessly optimistic about his job at the Krusty Krab as a fry cook there, even though his boss, Mr. Krabs, is the stingiest man alive, and they constantly have to fend off attacks from this evil guy Plankton, who is a plankton, and tries to run a rival business, the Chum Bucket, that is across the street. That business never gets any customers, and Plankton is really quite the piece of work. So on one road, living next to each other, you have SpongeBob, Squidward, and Patrick. SpongeBob and Patrick are best friends. Squidward is their annoyed neighbor, who secretly kind of likes their childish antics, which I will get into later. Then you have down at the Krusty Krab, Squidward and SpongeBob's boss at the restaurant is Mr. Krabs. He has this daughter Pearl, who is a whale. That's enough of a premise for you to remember and familiarize yourself with the kind of hijinks you can expect from this show. Number 10, Club SpongeBob. In this episode, there is this big tree house beside SpongeBob's house, and he's playing up there with his friend Patrick, and they're staring out the window, being goofy and making fun of Squidward, who is traveling to work on a bike. And they're like, look, it's Widward, Widward's going to work. And they're laughing their heads off. Squidward gets really annoyed with them, and he's like, what is that supposed to mean? What are you making fun of me for? And SpongeBob says, we can't tell you because you're not a member of our club. So Squidward gets very indignant and is like, oh no, I can get into that club if I want to. And they insist, no, you can't get in even if you tried. So he gets up there. He climbs up the tree to get in the treehouse. He fits, but just barely, and they are all smushed into each other in the treehouse. He's really annoyed now that he's stuck with them. He feels like it was a trap. And that is what is so funny. Because in that opening scene already, you see how funny the dynamic is because genuinely, they literally meant you cannot get in. Not you won't fit in, metaphorically. Literally, you cannot get in. But he didn't believe that. He thought they were really up to something negative, and so he wanted to prove them wrong. And also in the interaction, you see how he genuinely wanted to hang out with them and be a part of their club. So every time he seems to brush them off as children that he wants nothing to do with, sometimes his actions tell a different story. So once he's there, he tries to get out of the treehouse by basically pulling on a branch, but it ends up turning the whole tree into like a slingshot. And the treehouse flies off the tree and goes sailing across the sky. And one guy is like, "Make a wish, honey," as it flies past him. It lands in the woods. So they are lost. It's Squidward stuck with SpongeBob and Patrick alone in the woods. And please note that every episode of SpongeBob is 11 minutes. So it's extra funny to know that when Squidward says, when he's trapped with SpongeBob and Patrick, "Why does every 11 minutes of my life have to be filled with misery?" Then he's trying to figure out how to get out, and SpongeBob suggests, "Why don't we use the magic conch shell?" That is how a generation learned to mispronounce conch shell. But anyway, he says conch in the show again and again, so I'm gonna say conch, because that's what I grew up saying because of SpongeBob. Anyway, so this conch shell, they pull the string and this toy gives them a response. It's like a magic 8-ball with a voice. So they ask it some funny questions, and they ask this conch shell, "What do we do to get out of this forest?" And the conch says, "Nothing." So they decide to do nothing. They literally sit there, and that's where you get that meme of SpongeBob and Patrick just staring wide-eyed into the distance in the woods, waiting for the conch's magic to pay off. Squidward thinks this is super dumb, so he decides to just do his own thing. So he goes to make up his own little makeshift tent and fire pit and cook himself some bugs for dinner and just flex his survival skills. And he tries to, show off that he's better equipped for this than these dumb people over there. He's laughing it up, saying, "You guys really think that everything you need will just fall right out of the sky." Then a plane with the big label on the side saying Picnic Supply Inc., the pilots say, "We're falling out of the sky. We gotta drop the load." So they do. And the entire picnic supply they had, which happened to include a burning fire, an already made tent, and a frickin' banquet, drop it down exactly in front of the open-eyed SpongeBob and Patrick. And so Squidward is just really losing it, because compared to his little ramshackle setup, this is very extravagant. So he has to win over their good graces again, to have access to the banquet, but then when he does, he realizes that this isn't going to work for him. Actually, at one point he claims the conch shell knows nothing, and SpongeBob says, "Squidward, this copyrighted conch is the cornerstone of our organization." And Patrick mutters, "Maybe he's not a brother." So anyway, he tries to win over this suspicious conch, but the shell seems to detect that he doesn't believe in its powers, and so he keeps asking the conch, "Can I have something to eat?" And the conch says, "No," in a sassy voice. So he is basically combusting with anger at this point. But then help is on the way. This park ranger shows up. He's been cutting his way through the trees. Well, the kelp, really, but whatever. And he says it's his conch shell that told him to go save them. So they all do the magic conch loo sound effect. And the final line is all hail the magic conch. Number 9, Krabby Land. It is the first day of summer, and Mr. Krabs is elated because summer means more customers. Kids are out of school and they're going to spend their allowances at the Krusty Krab. So he is so excited and basically tells SpongeBob this magical story about their allowances as the true meaning of summer. Then no kids show up, and he's wondering why and realizes they're all playing on a playground across the street. So he goes down there angrily to see what's up and why they're all over there instead of buying his Krabby Patties. And it's nothing suspicious, it's just kids playing at a park. And SpongeBob's like, "You see them, Mr. Krabs?" And he says, "Oh, I see them. Look at them. So weak and malnourished, with nobody trying to sell them anything. It breaks me heart. No!" And he says this big no that causes all the kids to just stop what they're doing and stare at him. And then he gets so extra and says, "I've got nothing to live for, SpongeBob." He's really, really distraught over losing customers and seeing them enter this environment without commercials anywhere. So then he hatches a plan to build his own playground. He presents this playground, which draws a big crowd of kids. And SpongeBob's excited too, because he's like a kid himself. And then he pulls the curtain off and we see the playground Mr. Krabs made is awful. Rides include the toaster rodeo, which are just toasters on springboards, a homemade slide that breaks the second someone climbs up it, a ball pit that's just consisting of bowling balls, Hose World, which is an attraction that just looks like a line of water hoses, etc., etc. So then Mr. Krabs decides, don't worry, you guys, if you don't like this playground, stay tuned because the biggest, best part is yet to come. Krabby the Clown will be here. So they're all excited to meet Krabby the Clown, and SpongeBob says, where's Krabby? And Mr. Krabs says, he'll be here after I count the money. Just stall him. And he leaves to count money, leaving SpongeBob to entertain these really ticked off kids who are so mean to him. And once SpongeBob realizes what is getting their attention are his antics where he puts himself in harm's way, he keeps doing them. And genuinely is excited to do them because he's making other people happy. So the kids keep hooting it up as he puts bubble soap in his eyes, lets these two tough guys use him as their tennis ball, essentially, pays someone to run over him with a truck. Just such insane antics, all for their laughs. But at one point, he's done. He can't do this anymore. You see he's all bandaged and bruised, and he shows up to Mr. Krabs' office, where Mr. Krabs is counting the money. And he says, Mr. Krabs, I can't take any more of this stalling stuff. And Mr. Krabs says, always thinking about yourself. Get back there and stall him. And what happened to your arms and legs, boy? SpongeBob says, the kids are using them as boomerangs. Mr. Krabs says, boomerangs? Oh no, they might break my windows. SpongeBob, genuinely concerned for those windows, says, what should we do? And Mr. Krabs says, well, now that all the money is counted, tell them Krabby the Clown is here. It turns out Krabby the Clown is just Mr. Krabs in a super cheap disguise. When all the kids are stuck looking distraught over this pathetic attempt to make them so excited over a celeb appearance, SpongeBob is seen distraught too that the real Krabby the Clown was not there. So he's crying. He goes to Mr. Krabs and calls him cheap. Mr. Krabs says he isn't cheap before he takes the clown nose off his head, rubs it on his shirt to reveal it was just a spray-painted apple, and says, now take this back to the kitchen before it spoils. SpongeBob says, but what about the true meaning of summer? What about the children? Mr. Krabs says, the children? I don't care about the children. I just care about their parents' money. The fact that their feeble minds are easily manipulated by things like cheap clowns is no skin off of my nose. Survival of the fittest, SpongeBob. Turns out, all those ticked off little kids heard him say that, and they really come at him. So now he's the one getting beaten up, basically, tortured by the same guys who SpongeBob paid to hurt him for the kids' entertainment. Then the episode ends where someone finds the bag of money Mr. Krabs had been counting and gets on top of the restaurant and starts making it rain. And SpongeBob says, wow, thousands of dollars floating in the breeze. I guess that's the true meaning of summer. Number 8, Wormy. Sandy the squirrel is leaving town and needs SpongeBob and Patrick to pet sit for her. So they decide to do that, and they really grow fond of one of her pets, the caterpillar named Wormy. They've never seen a caterpillar before. They don't know what a caterpillar is. That's pivotal for this story's sake. They have the cutest, most wholesome montage of adventures with this caterpillar, playing hide and seek, swinging in circles together. They make him a best friend ribbon. Patrick says, why must the sun set on this beautiful day? And SpongeBob says, don't be sad. We'll be back first thing in the morning for frolic and fun. And they leave. It turns out Wormy overnight turned into a butterfly. So when Patrick and SpongeBob show up the next morning to play with their friend Wormy, all they see are the shreds of a cocoon and that best friend ribbon they made him. So they think someone ate Wormy. And they realize the monster they see, this butterfly, is what must have eaten Wormy. And they have these repeated close-ups in the episode where you see from a character's point of view how they see this butterfly. And the butterfly on their face, right up close, is really like you see the beady black eyes and stuff and hear the big buzzing. Like you can see from their point of view, having never seen or heard this before, why it alarms them so much. So anyway, they try a bunch of different things to try to get this monster away from people. But it ends up somehow leaving Sandy's house and heading towards the Krusty Krab. They decide they'll stop it by using the secret entrance, which is just the biggest boulder I've ever seen. smack dab in the middle of the restaurant all of a sudden for this one episode. So they use that secret entrance to try to warn everyone about the monster, and it just keeps happening, where they keep running all over town, warning people, and there are these funny scenes that ensue where we see crowds running away from this butterfly. Really fast, all of a sudden, the whole town is in shambles or on fire. You see that destruction and SpongeBob and Patrick just saying, "We did it, we saved the city." That is where that meme comes from. I think my favorite part of this episode is when the crowds of people screaming and running from the monster stop at the stoplight and they wait, and people going the opposite direction, the other crowd of running, screaming people go, and then when the light changes, they run again, and then the light stops and you see the butterfly stop too, and the butterfly goes when the light goes green too. It's all very orderly. Sandy finally comes back in town, puts this butterfly in a jar, and everyone emerges from hiding to give her this grand celebration for saving the town. And she just thinks it's because they missed her so much. Of course she does. She's quite prideful. Number 7. Chocolate with nuts. SpongeBob ends up accidentally getting Squidward's mail, which includes a copy of Fancy Living Digest. He says, "Whoa, look at these glossy depictions of a higher standard of living." And he's just amazed by it. And he says, "Patrick, you know what we gotta do? We gotta make that money and become rich too. We should become entrepreneurs." So they decide what they're gonna do to become rich people living the fancy life is sell chocolate bars door to door. Their attempts at this just get more and more absurd. They start by selling to this one guy who ends up screaming, "Chocolate, chocolate, chocolate," and chasing them around town. They try to offer chocolate to one woman who gets impatient, eventually slams the door in their face. One guy turns away because SpongeBob said, "Flatter the customer," and Patrick just said, "I love you." Someone closed the door on them because they were just focusing too much. SpongeBob said, "Focus," and Patrick did, and his eyes basically shot out of his head with focusing. Then you have this one con artist. The guy sold chocolate to, but he said, "You need my patented candy bar bags." So they buy a ton of these bags. He says are designed to specifically hold their chocolate bars. Then they go next door and it looks like the same guy. They say, "Aren't you the guy we just talked to?" And he says, "I don't recall. Here's what you two need. Candy bar bag carrying bags." So they put all the little bags they just bought into big bags they just bought. So now they're basically losing money. They're getting distraught, not knowing when they will finally be able to live that rich and fancy life. So Patrick says, "I've got it, let's get naked." And SpongeBob says, "No, let's save that for when we're buying real estate." They decide instead to stretch the truth. That is their big line. We've got to stretch the truth to sell. So they claim their chocolate will do all sorts of stuff for you, and they tailor it to different customers. So they tell one guy it'll make you sound smart. One guy, they say you'll walk through walls. One guy, they say you'll rule the world. They tell one guy it'll make your hair grow. Patrick tells someone who looks like his identical twin it'll keep your face from getting any uglier. Then they decide to put on a bunch of crutches and bandages and say they need an operation. When they go to a house, a guy is there, also dressed up in tons of crutches and bandages. They say we need an operation, and this guy says, "Small world, what's wrong with you guys?" SpongeBob says, we have some head trauma and eternal bleeding." He said, some guys have all the luck. I was born with glass bones and paper skin. Every morning I break my legs, and every afternoon I break my arms. At night I lie awake in agony until my heart attacks put me to sleep." And so he convinces them to help him sell chocolate bars. He says, "My medical bills are extremely high, but luckily I'm able to keep myself alive by selling chocolate bars." Turns out the guy, disguised in all of those bandages and such, was the same scammer who got them to buy his candy bar bags and then the candy bar bag carrying bags. So now they really are broke and don't know what to do until the guy who's been screaming chocolate and running and chasing them this whole time catches up to them. And they're so scared because he's like, "Finally, I've been trying to get you boys all day, and now that I've got you right where I want you," and he suddenly gets real quiet and says, "I'd like to buy all your chocolate." So he buys all of their chocolate. Then they literally have a wheelbarrow full of cash and decide to spend it on a private dinner out with an old woman and her mom. They convinced her to buy the chocolate because it would help her live forever. And it actually was totally an accident why they met her, because they were just trying to flatter this super old woman by saying, "Is your mother home?" And then they were shocked that she brought out her mom, who looked very, very, very shriveled up. And that's when they said, maybe you want this chocolate to help you live forever. Then the younger of the two old people said, "I hate you," but bought it because her mom wanted her to. Number 6. Dying for pie. Mr. Krabs wants his employees to exchange gifts for Employee Brotherhood Day. SpongeBob makes Squidward a sweater made out of eyelashes. Squidward is just creeped out, so SpongeBob then gives him a new one saying, "Is this one better, Squidward? I made this one with my tears." Then he's guilted into giving something to SpongeBob. He doesn't know what to get him, but he hears some pirates who just happen to be talking about their booty behind the restaurant. So he buys a pie from them, despite their claims at first that it was a bomb. But the second they heard he was going to buy it, they were like, "Oh wait, we were just kidding, here it is." Good enough for him. He buys this bomb pie, literally, and leaves it out with a note for SpongeBob that says, "To SpongeBob." Well, here you go. Squidward then goes to show Mr. Krabs what he got SpongeBob, and Mr. Krabs says, "Hold up, I want to taste this first." Trips as he goes to get milk, because he said it would go great with milk, and the milk is so perfectly perched right beside a giant rock that Mr. Krabs just happens to trip over. Anyway, so the pie goes flying and explodes. The piece of it he was holding caused this mini eruption, and Mr. Krabs says, "So, you thought you'd kill me over a little New Age management, eh?" Then SpongeBob shows up and says, "Thanks for the pie, Squidward," and rubs his stomach, implying that he ate that bomb pie. So now Squidward's really sobbing and distraught. He explains what happened to Mr. Krabs, and Mr. Krabs says he's seen this 11 times before, and that once that pie hits his lower intestine at sunset, he's a goner. So Squidward says, "I gotta make his last hours meaningful. Give him so much love, he's gonna drown in it." So he decides to do that. Whatever SpongeBob wants to do for the next few hours before he dies. So SpongeBob breaks out this giant list of things he loves to do, and he says that the things he loves doing most are written in red. Everything's in red. SpongeBob says, "Yeah, I know!" And then they proceed to do everything on the list, which ranges from knock-knock jokes to introduce my best friend Squidward to everybody in town. And then following that, introduce my best friend Squidward to everybody in town wearing a salmon suit. Basically, Squidward has had the longest day of his life. Then sunset is approaching, and SpongeBob says that this is so great. You, me, and this brick wall you built between us. He did build a brick wall between them. And then SpongeBob says, "You know, if I were to die right now in some sort of fiery explosion due to the carelessness of a friend, well, that would just be okay. It seems like something just hit my lower intestine. Here it is, the sunset." Then they try to count it down, and turns out SpongeBob did not explode. And then Squidward gets mad. He went from crying and thinking, well, at least I made his last hours meaningful, to enraged because he says, "You were supposed to explode into a million pieces because the pie you ate was a bomb." And then SpongeBob says, "Oh, you mean this pie?" Holds it up from his back pocket, says he was saving it for them to share. Then, of course, he trips over a perfectly placed giant rock in front of him. The pie explodes over both of them. 5. The camping episode. Every kid I went to school with, at least, knows the camping song, the CAMPFIRESONG song. And if you don't think that we can sing it faster, then you're wrong, but it'll help if you just sing along. But aside from that, this episode really lays out well how Patrick and SpongeBob's dynamics with Squidward always play out. So he ends up looking outside, seeing that SpongeBob and Patrick are camping, and he says, "It's not camping if you're 10 feet from your house." SpongeBob says, "It doesn't matter where you are as long as you're outdoors. While some soft city folks are stuck in their beds reading books, we're out here, arming ourselves against the formidable forces of nature. You want to join us?" Which felt like quite a dig because Squidward was just one of those soft city folks sitting in his bed reading a book. And he says no. SpongeBob says, "Okay, have fun inside." Squidward says, "What do you mean, have fun inside?" "Just have fun inside, see you tomorrow." "Oh, you little sneak. I see what you're doing. You're saying I'm soft. You're saying I can't take it. You think your little have fun inside challenge is gonna make me go camping with you. Well, that is never gonna happen, so get used to it." Then he leaves. SpongeBob mutters again, "Okay, have fun inside." And he says, "That's it, I'm in. He's so mad. He's like, I'll show you camping. But SpongeBob and Patrick are just excited. They're like, Squidward's gonna go camping with us. So time after time, no matter what they do, Squidward tries to do it better and does it worse or just gets the short end of the stick. For example, when they're roasting marshmallows, Patrick keeps roasting his too close to the flame. It sets on fire and he quick blows out the flame so that the whole goop flies onto Squidward's face. They sing that campfire song that annoys Squidward. Again and again, they are just not making this easy. Then, they try to stop Squidward from playing the clarinet, because SpongeBob says, it's too dangerous to play the clarinet badly out here in the wilderness. It might attract a sea bear. Squidward says sea bears don't exist. SpongeBob says, no, oh no, Squidward, sea bears are all too real. It said so in the Bikini Bottom Inquirer. He holds up a magazine that says, I married a sea bear. Patrick says, yeah, and Fake Science Monthly, which has a magazine cover that says sea bears and fairy tales are real, and then they proceed to warn Squidward about all the things you cannot do, because they will attract a sea bear. Squidward ends up doing every single thing on the list they warned him not to. Just a bunch of goofy stuff, wearing a hoop skirt, screeching like a chimpanzee, etc. Holding out a plate of cubed cheese because they said sliced would be fine, but cubed is what attracts a sea bear. Turns out a sea bear does show up, looking exactly as you would expect a hybrid of a fish and a bear to look like. Long story short, Squidward gets attacked by the sea bear, and basically SpongeBob and Patrick were proven to be right. Squidward just should have enjoyed some wholesome camping without questioning their motives, is I guess the lesson here. Number 4. Squilliam returns. Squidward has this arch nemesis dating back to high school, Squilliam Fancy Son. And Squilliam is basically living the dream. He is living Squidward's dream. He lives in a super fancy house. He's always walking around wearing this plush bathrobe, and he's got this unibrow that he always calls big and valuable in that sassy tone. He's basically just the most on-the-nose caricature of a rich dude, a rich butthole dude that you can expect. So he's always mocking his success in Squidward's face, rubbing it in, and saying, I'm living the life you wish you could live. And always also then making fun of the fact Squidward is just a cashier at a fast food restaurant. So Squidward is like, I'll show him, and gets really mad, and lies one day saying, actually, I own a 5-star restaurant. Then Squilliam and his entourage of friends he probably just paid to hang out with him say, we would love to come to your restaurant tonight. So now Squidward has to, by nighttime, turn this fast food restaurant into what looks like a fancy 5-star place. Why he didn't just say, we're booked up, you have to make a reservation for way in the future, I don't know. But anyway, so he tries to train SpongeBob, Patrick, and Mr. Krabs to play, essentially cosplay as fancy waiters, fancy chefs, etc. It's not working out so well because Mr. Krabs is making an appetizer so awful. It comes to life as a hideous monster at some point that looks like it's going to actually eat them. Then there's Patrick, who is not helpful at all. If you're wondering, Patrick doesn't work at the Krusty Krab, why is he even there? It's because he said, I thought the core would help straighten out my life. And Squidward is about to say, this isn't the core, but he's like, beggars can't be choosers. You can serve as the guy who takes their hats and coats. Then there's SpongeBob, who doesn't even know what a waiter is. He spent his whole life at their fast food restaurant where you just get your food at the counter. So he has to learn not only what a waiter is, but he has to read this giant manual Squidward gave him, called How to Become a Fancy Waiter in Less Than 20 Minutes. He's really losing it because it's such a huge book, and he really wants to show his loyalty and support to Squidward, but he really can't do it. He can't memorize this giant book, and he is really freaking out. And so Squidward tries to get him through this freak out by walking him through a visualization calming technique of sorts, where he says, I want you to empty your mind of anything that doesn't have to do with fine dining and breathing. That's all you need to know. Empty your mind of everything else. Then there is this wonderful metaphor. When we see SpongeBob, I've actually probably talked about this on the show before, because I use it to describe my brain all the time to people. My super anxiety-ridden brain. We see in SpongeBob's brain a bunch of office workers, and one little SpongeBob in the brain yells to the other identical ones, just got an order from the boss, dump everything that doesn't have to do with fine dining and breathing. So they do. You see all the little office workers shredding files, burning files, flushing files down toilets, whatever they gotta do. One of the workers may be slacking off for a second, so the boss, SpongeBob, says, "Hurry up, what do you think I'm paying you for?" And the other one says, "You don't pay me. We don't even exist. We're just a clever visual metaphor used to personify the abstract concept of thought. One more crack like that and you're out of here. No, please, I have 3 kids." And then the scene ends. By some miracle, this weird meditative state SpongeBob was in, this trance, when this was happening in his head, works. And he becomes a stellar, fancy waiter who is given the Krusty Krab the full 5-star makeover Squidward had been dreaming of. Squilliam has to admit the place is beautiful and fabulous, and everything is just going perfectly. He is so impressed and shocked, and so is Squidward that he could pull this off, and how well everything is going. But then Squilliam says, "Who really won me over was your brilliant waiter. I must know your name." Well, we go back to the office workers in SpongeBob's head, who are freaking out now because they threw out the file with his name on it. They had to dump all the files that had nothing to do with fine dining and breathing, so SpongeBob forgets his name. And he basically loses it then and there, has a big breakdown. Why Squidward didn't just cover for him and say his name's SpongeBob, I don't know. Just when you think it can't get more chaotic, suddenly that appetizer monster I was talking about breaks in and starts terrorizing people. It's a whole hot mess. And then Squilliam admits, "Look, actually, I made up all this stuff about my life. I don't have fancy yachts, jets, or anything. I was only trying to impress you." Squidward says, "Is that true?" And he says, "Of course not. I'm filthy stinking rich." Number 3. Squid on strike. Mr. Krabs decides that he wants to start charging his employees more, even for things like breathing and lollygagging. So he, instead of giving them their paychecks, or as Squidward says, yes, our meager restitution, he gives them bills for doing things like standing, existing, all listed as costing them. This is the final straw for Squidward. Mr. Krabs has always been a bad boss to them, but this is too far. So he decides to go on strike and convinces SpongeBob to go with him, because SpongeBob adores Squidward. But SpongeBob does not know what a strike is. So he blindly follows Squidward's orders, and he clearly does not understand how to do this. So when Squidward tries to teach him how to make picket signs, SpongeBob makes one about "I love the Krusty Krab." He makes a different one where instead of saying Krusty Krab unfair, he says fun fair. He just loves this place and doesn't understand how striking works. He keeps making it worse, so Squidward tells him to just go stand over there. That will be helpful. Standing over there meaning he ends up behind a pole or a tree or something, out of sight. And Squidward starts a speech in a megaphone that attracts a crowd. SpongeBob says, "Gee, I don't know what Squidward's talking about, but it sure sounds convincing." One of the people in the crowd says, "What's that guy talking about?" And the guy next to him says, "I don't know, but he's got a megaphone." And they keep cheering him on. So the crowd seems really fired up and into this speech where Squidward says all sorts of phrases like, "We are never going to again set foot in Mr. Krabs' house of servitude. We will dismantle his oppressive establishment board by board, saw the tables of impunity in half, etc., etc. We will bring the hammer of the people's will crashing down on the house of servitude." He is really fired up, and clearly the crowd is just as clueless as SpongeBob, because one of them says, "Wow, all this supporting is making me hungry." And the guy next to her says, "Hey everyone, let's go get a Krabby Patty." And they all stampede over Squidward into the restaurant. Then Squidward mutters, "Nobody cares about the fate of labor as long as they can get their instant gratification." That night, Mr. Krabs comes to Squidward's house to beg him to come back to work, because the teenagers he hired are just ruining the business and he wants his golden boys back. So Squidward says, "Fine, but let's discuss my terms of coming back." So they go on a long walk, hashing out a deal. Meanwhile, SpongeBob says, "Squidward was right. I can't just sit here, it's time for action." And he takes literally everything Squidward just talked about. So he goes to the Krusty Krab at night to saw the tables of punity in half, to gnaw at the ankles of big business. Yes, which involves gnawing and eating poles in the place. He literally, as he says it, he's doing it, dismantles the oppressive establishment board by board. And he's so excited as he physically destroys this place. He says, "Squidward will be so proud." So the place is a mess. SpongeBob is so excited to see Squidward's reaction to what he just did. And Squidward and Mr. Krabs show up, and Mr. Krabs literally falls apart into pieces and says, "In order to pay for these damages, you two are going to work for me forever." Squidward is horrified. All of his negotiations just went way out the window. But SpongeBob is whooping it up. He's like, "The strike works, Squidward. We got our jobs back forever." And at the end of the day, he never really learned how to strike. Number 2, Band Geeks. This is the classic episode that was actually the one that caused SpongeBob superfans to sign a petition, hoping that the SpongeBob scene where they perform at the Bubble Bowl would be recreated for the actual Super Bowl. And we sort of got that, but it was kind of a half-baked offering from SpongeBob's creators. I digress. This is the episode we were talking about. This is another one with Squilliam wrecking havoc on Squidward's life. Squidward is playing the clarinet as badly as he always does. So someone knocks on his door, he opens it, and they say, "Hi, we're with the pet hospital down the street, and we understand you have a dying animal on the premises." Squidward then answers his phone after slamming the door in their face, drops his clarinet and says, "Hello, you've reached the house of unrecognized talent." Turns out who's on the end of the line is Squilliam. He says, "My marching band is busy and we can't play the Bubble Bowl next week. So I was wondering if you and your band could cover for us." And then he wants to mock Squidward and say, "I knew it. You don't even have a band. Well, I'll just let you get back to the service industry now." But Squidward is determined to prove him wrong. So he decides to create a marching band. He puts flyers all over Bikini Bottom, and a huge cast of classic SpongeBob characters shows up for band practice that night. So many funny antics ensue where they really get on each other's nerves. There's a really iconic scene where Patrick kicks Sandy, and Sandy ends up shoving his head up a trumpet, and the way he yells, his off-screen yell before he walks back in the room, and you see what the trumpet did to him, it's just so classic. The comedic timing in this episode is everything, because as the practice goes on, the transitions where the narrator says, day 1, day 2, day 3 of practice are just perfectly timed. So something bizarre happens in the episode during band practice, and then before you have much time to really contemplate, wait, what just happened? The narrator's like, and we move on to day 2. And that keeps happening. By the final night of practice, tensions are so insanely high. One band member looks right at Mr. Krabs when he says, "Maybe we wouldn't sound so bad if somebody didn't play with big, meaty claws." Mr. Krabs says, "Well, these claws ain't just for attracting mates," and puts his hands up like to punch him. So the guy's like, "Bring it on, old man, bring it on." SpongeBob says, "No, people, let's be smart and bring it off." And then this other fish says, "Oh, so now the talking cheese is gonna preach to us." Then everyone is in this enormous fist fight, physical fights everywhere, shoving instruments at each other. It's such a hot mess. So Squidward gives them this mournful little monologue, ending with thanks for nothing, and slowly exits the building. So all these band members are now left standing in shock there, feeling like we really let him down. So SpongeBob creates this iconic, rousing speech to convince them to still come together and pull this off for Squidward. Because he says, "What kind of monsters are we? That poor creature came to us in his hour of need, and we failed him. Squidward's always been there for us when it was convenient for him. If we could just pretend that Squidward is a fireman or some guy in an ambulance, then I think we could all know what it means to be in a marching band. Now let's make Squidward proud." And they get back to work. The next day, they end up performing an incredible performance at the Bubble Bowl. They all teamed up to sing Sweet Victory. Squilliam is so shocked that he passes out, is carried away on a stretcher. Squidward is triumphant. It is a rare win for him that they all came together and truly learned what it means to be in a marching band. My all-time favorite episode: SpongeBob meets the Strangler. In this episode, there is this criminal around town, the Tattletale Strangler. He is always threatening to strangle anyone who rats him out for his crimes, which are things like littering. That is a huge no-no in Bikini Bottom. We'll talk more about that in a second. The cops are really not bright in Bikini Bottom. And they basically handcuff this strangler when SpongeBob turns him in and says, "Don't worry, SpongeBob, he's not going to come for you. He'll never get away." And of course he got away from them. And they say, "We ain't bodyguards, kid," and drive away when SpongeBob asks if he can now get protection because the strangler will be after him for ratting him out for littering. So he goes all around town trying to find a bodyguard now, and he ends up picking for his bodyguard this mysterious stranger who turns out to be the Tattletale Strangler in a fake mustache, which in a nice touch still has the tag on it. And SpongeBob is so excited, he sees his business card which says Strangler on it, but he crossed it out, and so now it says on top of that, bodyguard, and SpongeBob says, "Looks good to me, you're hired. I feel safer already. Oh, bodyguard, my body is in your guarding hands. What do we do now?" The Strangler really wants to get SpongeBob alone, so he says, while posing as his bodyguard, "Let's go somewhere nice and dark and quiet, behind a dumpster or a dark alley." SpongeBob just says cheerily, "We can go to my house and turn off all the lights." And then he says, "But first I gotta run a few errands." Throughout the day, this criminal gets endlessly annoyed and frustrated and impatient with SpongeBob as he has to go to the grocery store with him, goes to buy paper towels, goes to the dry cleaners, goes to test perfume samples, has to go run errands with SpongeBob while waiting for his chance to strangle him at his house. Just when he thinks finally it's time for my revenge, then they get to SpongeBob's house and he's like, "Finally, time for my revenge." SpongeBob stops before opening the door and says, "Bodyguard, let me just take this moment to say you're the best bodyguard." And he's like, "All right, come on, open the door." Spends hours trying to find the key to the front door. So now the Strangler's like, "That's it, I've had it. We need to get into your house." He's lost it. So he says, "Let's just climb through this window. Can you give me a boost up?" SpongeBob, who now wears spiky cleats, suddenly says in his usual cheery, naive tone, "Sure. With these spiky cleats, anything is possible." And he jumps up on this guy's shoulders, ends up in his eye sockets with the cleats. So he's running around trying to get SpongeBob out from gouging his eyes out for hours. Then finally, when he has pulled the cleats out of his eyes and has tried to bandage up his eyeballs, he is so like, "Come on, let's get into your house already." And so SpongeBob comforts him and says, "Don't worry, bodyguard. Let me just get the key I keep under the mat, and then we can get inside." And he finds the key from under the rug. Then, finally, the bodyguard's like, "Yes, I can strangle him. I've got my revenge. We are finally alone in his house. No one will know." And then all of a sudden the lights turn on and we see it's a massive surprise party for SpongeBob to celebrate his perfect on-time percentage at work. And he's like, "Oh, how did you guys know?" And Patrick's like, "It's on the invitations you sent us. Let's boogie." And they all boogie for hours. And the Strangler's just sitting in a corner looking so distraught as he waits for this party to finish. The crowd is finally ushered out of the house. And this Strangler's like, "Finally, time for revenge." But then the lights turn on again and everyone's back in the house saying, "Happy birthday, SpongeBob." They have a second party for his birthday, which was also planned. SpongeBob was like, "How did you guys know today was my birthday?" And Patrick says, "We just do what the invitations say. Let's boogie some more." Then everyone leaves again. And the Strangler's like, "Fine, we're finally alone." But then Patrick shows back up. And he's like, "Great parties, huh?" So he tries to kick him out. And he says, "We can't take chances with this guy. We gotta get him out. He could be the Strangler." And so Patrick, who's not the brightest, says, "I'm the Strangler? I should have known. I gotta turn myself in." He runs out of there. And SpongeBob, still super naive, says, "So, Patrick's the Strangler. Gee, you think you know a guy." And this guy has just lost it. It's not worth it anymore. SpongeBob, through his sheer naivete and innocence and patience, has driven this criminal to tears and screams. He rips off his fake mustache and he runs out of the house. And he keeps running to different locations, and SpongeBob follows him, still being clueless and naive. So for example, he gets on an airplane out of there, and then SpongeBob is seen on the seat next to him like, "Good thinking, bodyguard. The Strangler will never find us up here." Then he parachutes out of the plane. SpongeBob is seen following him saying, "Good thinking, bodyguard. The Strangler could have been on that plane." And so it goes. Until he ends up falling out of the sky into a jail cell, of course. The cops finally show back up and are like, "Good job, SpongeBob. You put the Strangler behind bars." They didn't do anything to help with that. And so the Strangler was literally crying at the end of this episode. So emotionally worn down by this happy, naive, gullible sponge. SpongeBob finally realizes it was the Strangler he spent his whole day with, not realizing he was torturing him, but he had been, just through his mundane errands and happy attitude. So the Strangler is finally behind bars. SpongeBob feels safe from him. But then the Strangler turns around in the cell, and Patrick is there saying, "What are you in for?" Over the course of all of these episodes, you see how SpongeBob has this boundless optimism and always sees the best in other people. But because they don't reciprocate that, it leads him to be a nuisance to them. But you have all these moments where Squidward basically admits he kind of likes it, and he likes having that annoying but still childish person living next door. He wants to go camping with him. He wants an excuse to go into the treehouse with him. And he just convinces himself he's doing it to give this meanie a piece of his mind, but I think there's more to it. Not only do these characters have really interesting dynamics where a key source of the tension among them is differing levels of maturity, which changes how they see the world, the show is also full of social commentary. Not just about how growing up can leave you jaded, but you've got the kind of stuff Mr. Krabs says and does. Like with Krabbyland, taking advantage of people, selling chocolate, and when they do, they say, "We've got to stretch the truth to sell more chocolate." You have Squidward realizing he's never going to be truly satisfied, always pining after the life of Squilliam and comparing his circumstances to Squilliam's. You've got in SpongeBob meets the Strangler, a sense that an investigation was fumbled, and that definitely happens in real life. So there's a lot to read into it. There are a ton of miscellaneous quotes and honorable mention episodes I want to run through real quick. Just some further commentary this show makes. There's No Free Rides, an episode where Mrs. Puff is so tired of SpongeBob failing his boating exam that she tries to get him out of her hair by giving him extra credit and convincing herself it's okay. He passed the extra credit. He'll be fine. She's trying to teach herself that getting him off the hook with extra credit was fine. No consequences there. Giving him a license before he fully earned it. She obviously learns that was not the case. She couldn't erase her guilt over doing that. But she says in that episode when SpongeBob asks, "What's extra credit?" She says, "It's when you get credit for doing things you weren't able to do before." She also has the fun words of a teacher when she says stuff like, "I'm in the middle of a coffee-fueled sermon right now. You can't afford to miss this. And sorry I'm late. I was on my way to work when I got hit by that whole 'I'm gonna be doing this for the rest of my life' thing. It reared its ugly head and anyway." There are other episodes where SpongeBob says that too. Like, "There's so much in life I want to do as an adult still." And all you see is like a guy talking into his headset in the office and then going to bed and that's his day. There's Shell of a Man where Mr. Krabs molts. He outgrows his shell, so he's really self-conscious and doesn't want to go to his naval buddy's reunion party. So he has SpongeBob dress up in his old shell and pretend to be him. Obviously it doesn't work eventually, but then he realizes everyone else there was faking stuff too. Faking abs, faking tattoos, a diamond eye, an iron eye, excuse me. He admitted it was actually made of Formica. One guy was faking his cool sideburns. Everyone was putting on an act to look tough. And at the end, they award the yearly Manly Toughness Trophy to Mr. Krabs again, because they say admitting you lost your shell was the toughest thing we've ever seen. There's Selling Out. In that episode, Mr. Krabs is so in love with money that he takes this massive payout and sells his restaurant to this big corporation. They turn it into the Krabby-O Mondays. It turns into this big thing where everyone looks and acts the same. Food is suddenly made not by hand, but by a conveyor belt. When you want to act like an individual and not just put on your uniform and go through the exact motions the way the boss wants it, he threatens you with human resources, which turns out to be just this big, bulky dude lurking in the corner. At one point, Mr. Krabs goes back to the restaurant. Retirement wasn't for him, he got bored, and he gets so mad he starts destroying the place. So the new boss, Carl, calls in backup and says, "Code Red, free thinker." There's Squidville, where Squidward moves into a squids-only neighborhood and gets very bored. He's excited at first, but this new daily routine lacks the immaturity that made his days so fun and unpredictable and exciting back on the same street as SpongeBob and Patrick. He ends up being run out of town because he starts to act like a kid, playing with a reef blower and doing all this other stuff he learned from SpongeBob and Patrick. Then there's the lost mattress, where Mr. Krabs goes into a coma because he lost his money, he hit his head in a fit of rage and sorrow. It's a long story. But anyway, he's in the hospital and he has no insurance. So when the doctor's like, oh no, this is terrible. This man has no insurance. The nurse kicks him out of the room, puts him in front of the vending machine. Later on in the episode, they're in talks and they say, it looks like I'm gonna have to extract the patient from being in front of the vending machine so I can get to the Nutty Nut Bar. So then they move him to the sidewalk. Then the next serious debate they have about where to put this uninsured man is, well, we're trying to run a business here. You can't just have patients on the sidewalk. So they just kick his stretcher down the hill. Then there's a different episode where Squidward says, you're not gonna have a heart attack, are you? And Mr. Krabs says, not at these prices. These jokes are mostly for if you live in the USA to appreciate because of privatized healthcare, blah, blah, blah. Then there's the episode where Sandy's sleeping. She's in hibernation having a nightmare. And in the dream, she's talking about what she's going to do to her enemies in the dream. So she threatens to catch them and put them in jail. And then she mutters as she turns over to her side, at taxpayer expense. I could go on and on and on and on. The point being, this show not only has so many interesting rivalries, friendships, and other relationships among its many characters, but it mixes a lot of jokes just for kids, slapstick humor, nonsense jokes, with very funny jokes that they don't really register the same until you grow up. And then you kind of realize all along, you've been a SpongeBob as a kid, and you grow up and start to relate to Squidward on a new level. You get his cynicism, and you get his deep-rooted desire to still be a kid. You get his frustration with his cheap boss. You get why he literally wears an I really wish I weren't here right now button. And then there's the joy of thinking about killing people with kindness. That's basically what SpongeBob does. He leaves criminals literally driven to tears. He annoys people with his kindness and naivete to the point they end up lost in the woods with him or going camping with him or whatever. Basically, the show is all about a community, a town, with tons of clashing personalities, perspectives, experiences, intelligence levels, and it just makes for a very, very clever show. I could continue to go on, but I just want to end with two final thoughts. First of all, I just need a platform to finally share a big theory I have about SpongeBob. Remember the episode where he's worried about what secret photo or what secret thing Patrick has in his box. And he says, what if the secret box holds that photo of me at the Christmas party? And so we don't know what it is that is this collateral used on this innocent sponge. But I think it was a picture of him littering. I think littering, based on other episodes too, and after all, the Strangler's main crime was littering, and he was the worst of the worst in the town, I really think littering is the ultimate felony in Bikini Bottom. So I think it was a picture of him littering. Just wanted to put that out there because I had no platform to put my theory out there. You heard it here first. If it's confirmed true someday. I would like to end today's episode with some excerpts from a paper I wrote in college all about SpongeBob. The assignment was to find a popular TV show or movie and analyze psychologically, sociologically, etc. what that movie or show says about growing up. How do they define adulthood? What does that look like? So I did that for the SpongeBob movie while everyone else was doing like Mean Girls or something normal. And I think I helped summarize SpongeBob's appeal through that essay, which I will link to the full thing. I'll post it on my site eventually, but here is a taste. SpongeBob went from vehemently denying being a child to accepting it, while maintaining that age is irrelevant to the level of success that can be achieved. SpongeBob's journey helped him explore both his childlike and mature traits, and this introspection led him to embrace both. There are major benefits to not resisting growing up while simultaneously not neglecting the inner child. According to psychologist Stephen A. Diamond, we were all once children and still have that child dwelling within us, but most adults are quite unaware of this. And this lack of conscious relatedness to our own inner child is precisely where so many behavioral, emotional, and relationship difficulties stem from. In SpongeBob's case, these difficulties took the form of animosity between himself and everyone who berated his immaturity throughout his journey. One of those people, Mr. Krabs, dealt with some introspection that changed his beliefs as well. At the end of the movie, when King Neptune unfreezes Krabs, he changes his mind and gives the management position to SpongeBob, realizing that SpongeBob not only saved his life, but did so after winning heroic battles that proved his childlike qualities did not prevent him from succeeding in something Krabs assumed only adults could handle. SpongeBob acted incredibly naive when he basically gave away his car to a thief, but he did eventually find his car again, and took it back after courageously facing an uncomfortable situation. He got sidetracked during that situation, but he was eventually able to refocus and get the car key back. Later on in the story, he sobbed and almost gave up his mission entirely, but he eventually pulled through and succeeded. SpongeBob may have exhibited traits and behaviors throughout his journey that are stereotyped as childlike: innocence, being distracted by bubbles, crying, but he also showed admirable qualities that showcased maturity, such as perseverance and bravery. The fact that Mr. Krabs changed his mind and gave SpongeBob the promotion also shows the realization that acting like a kid and acting like an adult are not mutually exclusive. In short, SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs both went from treating the adult label as an isolated identity to realizing that it can coexist alongside the child label in the same person, and that the people who simultaneously fit into both categories, like SpongeBob, are no less capable of achieving success as anyone else. I hope today's guide to the best of the show helps encapsulate for you why these characters really are worth thinking about and what they say about growing up, society, groupthink, adulthood, the service industry and its reputation, healthcare, living in a diverse town, when pride gets you in trouble, etc., etc. Thank you all for listening. As always, please rate and review the show wherever you subscribe, and I'll talk to you all again very, very soon.